All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you talk to anybody out there who has been reading DC Comics for, well, really since the 90s, and you ask them, what would you say the top 5 comic book stories are from DC Comics, I guarantee you somewhere in that list will be Kingdom Come. And rightfully so. Kingdom Come is one of the greatest stories ever written by DC Comics, right? It's written by Mark Waid, and it's drawn by Alex Ross. For those of you guys who are curious about the artist, Alex Ross is kind of like the premier comic book artist, the definitive guy. Doesn't really draw comics as much as he used to. This guy is where it was at, and this story is kind of like the definitive DC story for a variety of reasons. So the reason we're covering this is, one, I'm going to be on a cruise for the next week and a half or so, and two, because we're covering Dark Crisis Infinite Frontier, and this is one of the worlds they landed on. And instead of just kind of giving you guys some sort of ad hoc explanation, I figured we would actually remaster the Kingdom Come series we did before and bring it to you here, so you can basically see what this story is about and why it's such a big deal they landed here. So the way the Kingdom Come opens up is it's really kind of given to us by a quote. Now, while this story does deal with like what is essentially a superhero or a superhuman civil war in DC Comics, really more of like a Civil War event before Marvel's Civil War, it's also just as much a religious story. It's not really on the nose or anything like that, like the God of Abraham will save us, but it's one of those things where there's a lot of religious underpinnings and kind of like Armageddon-esque scenarios and really just kind of an overall feel that goes with it. So what we get here is we're told, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. There fell a great star from the heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And I beheld and heard an angel saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth." And what you end up getting here is this kind of moment where you basically have Norman McKay, who is reading from the book of Revelation to Wesley Dodds. Now, this moment here is highly important, and it's really the most significant if you understand the history of Wesley Dodds. So, in DC Comics, way back in the 1980s, well, technically 1989, so really like the late 1980s, with Sandman Volume 2, Issue Number 1, we were introduced to a character that you've all probably heard of called Dream of the Endless. And the way this worked is that there came a point in time where in the DC continuity itself, back in the 1930s, Dream of the Endless had basically been trapped on Earth, right? Literally had his crystal taken away from him and all kinds of stuff. But regardless, he was stuck on Earth. And the result was that it wreaked havoc across the Earth itself, in the sense that if Dream of the Endless is captured, people can't dream properly. Their sleep doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So what you had were all these people across the world that were experiencing bouts of insomnia, or they were just sleeping continually, or they were having like waking dreams where basically they were awake, but they weren't really there. They were just dreaming all the time. Wesley Dodds is one of those guys. The big difference here is that Wesley Dodds had a lot of prophetic dreams. So he was essentially dreaming of the future, different things along those lines. What Kingdom Come does, and what's so cool about this, is this story was written back before you had the New 52. And what that means is this takes place during what was called New Earth, basically the continuity that came after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So there's only one universe here. And the reason why that matters is because when it came to New Earth and guys like Wesley Dodds, while he did technically get a new origin, a lot of it was pretty intact with the way he existed way back before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And the way this story is told, it really kind of harkens back to the heroes of yesteryear. So while technically this is post-Crisis, in a lot of ways, it feels like they're referencing the age of superheroes from the golden age of comics, from the 1940s in DC's publishing history. It's one of the reasons why I love it so much, right? Because Alex Ross art always reminds me of an era or a time when superheroes stood a little bit taller and walked a little more confidently, and there was no ambiguity determining the difference between the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys fought the bad guys and the day was saved, and that was it. There was no such thing as anti-heroes or anything like that. The waters weren't murky. But the reality here is that Wesley Dodds, even growing into his old age, had seemingly never lost the power of Dream of the Endless. And so what that means is that what he's experiencing right now are these visions. And he even tells Norman McKay, 7 thunders will utter their voices, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints. Babylon falls, Norman, be the one who listens to me. And this is why it's important, is because the way this is presented to us is that Wesley Dodds is considered to be a kook. He's considered to be a crazy person, right? These visions of the end times and the apocalypse coming and everything's going to die and come to an end, right? All that kind of stuff. Nobody really takes him seriously. And he can't convince anybody that these dreams that he's having are legitimate dreams. And even in the old Sandman stories, right? The old Wesley Dodd comics, that in a lot of ways, it was kind of the question, is this guy really insane, right? You really saw DC sort of toying with the idea that maybe he really was crazy. And so it was really cool because in order to basically calm him down, right, in order to calm him down and to keep him or get him back to a normal state, he tells Norman McKay, you have to read, right? You have to read from the book. Now, eventually Wesley Dodds passes on. And this is when Norman McKay basically gives us a kind of tour of what the world looks like. And we learn things like the United Nations has enacted more metahumans censures. And there's a reason why metahumans are censured, which basically means their ability to act publicly or speak or what have you is curtailed. Not necessarily in the sense that anything's actually being done, right? These are toothless measures that are happening. But what Norman tells us here is he says that he and Wesley Dodds and his wife, Norman's wife, that they were all friends at one point, and Wesley would come over and they would talk and different things along those lines. But he says before the bitterness overcame him, Wesley and I would walk, right? We would pick our way through the city. For hours, he'd bemoan the passing of things like Olympic Games and Nobel Prizes. Sometimes he'd ambush complete strangers and ask them how much they missed of the concept of human achievement. And he says, I don't know what surprised me more, the oddity of the question or the growing number of people who seemed to know what he was talking about. I tried to diffuse him. I would joke that he was just some old guy unable to appreciate this new generation, but he would never laugh. That Wesley insisted that human initiative began to erode the day people asked a new breed to face their future for them. Essentially, the first time heroes began to crop up, and the first time humanity looked at heroes to save them instead of humanity saving themselves. And he says he mocked their worth, these newcomers, and spoke instead of legends gone, of costume champions who had, in his day, inspired human achievement, not belittled it. He swore he'd never forget the world they came from. He wanted them to be remembered. And that's when you have Norman McKay, who goes into Planet Krypton, which is obviously a play on Planet Hollywood. And when he's in there, it's basically this entire restaurant modeled after the superheroes of yesteryear. Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, The Flash, these different guys, Batman, Superman, and so on, that the idea of superheroes has become almost a kind of thing that's a joke, right? It's almost a kind of commercialized concept, that instead of Wonder Woman standing for righteousness and paving the way for women to progress, instead of Superman representing everything humanity can become, instead of Batman representing what it means to be a dick, what you have is all these different characters who basically represent nonsense, right? They represent commercialization, and they represent the loss of what it means for society in terms of humans actually being something that's worth a damn. And so what happens is he says the Sandman had gone to his grave without one grain of faith in the future. And the saddest part was he was far from alone. With each passing day, hope for tomorrow has become more and more precious a commodity among everyday folk. Still, I tried to keep the faith and hew to the scriptures. According to the word of God, the meek would someday inherit the earth, but God never accounted for the mighty. Now, this is where we get the reality of how things had shifted. Now, we'll find out later on in terms of what had actually taken place that had led to this shift. But what he says here is that the world that Wesley Dodds had left behind was not the world that he remembered. Wesley Dodds, the Sandman, was from the world of Superman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, the Flash, these heroes that represented everything humanity was striving to be. That we as human beings are fallible, and we usually screw up more than we do things right. Not because we're somehow incompetent or inept, we are in a lot of ways, but only because we as human beings don't learn until we fail. If we could somehow know what the end result of our actions were going to be, what those consequences would be, we would never make mistakes. But it's only by making mistakes that we get better, and we look back on the consequences of those choices that we truly begin to realize what it is we lost or gained or anything along those lines. And that what had happened here is somewhere along the line, the traditional superheroes of old with DC Comics, Superman, Flash, and all those guys, they're out of the picture. And instead, they're now replaced by all these different heroes, or all these different superpowered beings that exist out there. But what Norman says is, I tell myself that this too shall pass, that humans still have a chance to reclaim a world rightfully theirs while it still exists. This is the face of superhuman might and superhuman odds. Time has not yet run out for humanity. And so the reality here is that when it comes to all these superpower beings out there, where initially they seem to rise up and replace these various superheroes that we're the most familiar with, which of course, again, we'll get back to them, but as these characters rose up, instead of them becoming a new breed of superhero that could basically help the world and make it a better place, that could somehow lead them into a greener pasture, instead of doing that, now these descendants of Superman and Wonder Woman and all these guys, right, these next generation of superheroes, even if they're not the biological children of Superman and all those different guys, that now they just fight for the sake of fighting, right? They just face off against each other for the sake of facing off against each other. There's no rhyme or reason here. There's no greater cause being served by all this. It's just people fighting for the sake of fighting. And there's a lot of innocent people who get caught in the collateral damage. Now, one of the things that we'll find over the course of Kingdom Come is that humanity actually brought it on itself. That this whole situation that you're seeing here is a perfect example of be careful what you ask for, you just might get it, because humanity did this to itself. And again, that's kind of the nature of what Mark Waid says here, is that we as people don't learn our lessons until we screw up. But amidst all this fighting that's taking place here, suddenly in Times Square, there's a journalist that comes on from the Daily Planet. You may be wondering why it's not Lois Lane. You'll find out. But basically, she says like a catastrophic event has happened in Kansas. And so before we find out what that is, we actually end up following Norman McKay once he returns to his church. And the reality here is the role he plays as the head of the church, right, with his congregation, is to instill hope in people whose hope is barely hanging on by a thread. Right, wrong, or otherwise, regardless of how you see religion, in a lot of ways, it really is just a concept of hope. That's really all it is, a construct for hope. How much faith people put in what they're hearing and how much conviction they tie to what they believe, it really just shifts from one person to the next. But religion as a whole is really nothing more than just a hope construct that some people latch onto for the idea of finding a better tomorrow or making sense out of the world in which they live. But Norman McKay cannot provide his congregation with the hope that they're looking for. All these individuals who have grown up in a time before all these new superheroes rose up and just started going crazy, they remember what the world was like, and they're looking to Norman McKay to help guide them back to remembering what that world was and that this won't all be this way. But Norman McKay has a hard time being hopeful, and in fact, he tells him, I can't do this. I'm sorry, I can't lie to you. I can't fill you with hope when I don't even have hope myself. And so his congregation, of course, basically ends up leaving. They don't so much abandon him, but they do feel a bit of trepidation and shame as they look at him and they see a man who has seemingly lost the faith. So how could a man with no faith possibly lead people who are in need of faith? And that's when a significantly important thing happens in the life of Norman McKay, when he's visited by the Spectre. Now, this is probably the part that you're waiting for. For a lot of you guys out there who had never read Kingdom Come, yes, the beginning of the story seems to have nothing to do with DC or any of the heroes we know. It takes a little bit to kind of get to that point, but it all begins to make sense. And so when the Spectre shows up here and basically tells Norman McKay, I need your aid here, the Spectre basically ends up revealing to Norman McKay what his purpose is. Not fully, but basically giving him an idea and simply saying, I have been sent here by a higher power in order to judge the world. Now, here's the thing about this, right? That when it comes to the Spectre, back when he initially came into existence, he operated independently. One of the things that DC did in order to both make the Spectre more grounded, as well as potentially give him a weakness, as well as have him essentially have a greater involvement in the DC landscape, was basically bond him to people. And that by bonding the Spectre to individuals, it was a way to almost turn the Spectre from this ethereal, godly imbued being to what was basically a superhero. It was kind of like that in the beginning, but the way the Spectre initially appeared back in the old school all-American comics basically began to move away and it began to shift. So by the time you got to the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, he was just this wildly powerful ethereal force that would just show up every once in a while. And while it was kind of cool, DC was wanting to bring him back to the world of being a superhero. And so that's one of the ways in which they did that. Plus, it was cool to have a person who was basically the embodiment of God's wrath walking around the world. And so what ends up happening is the Spectre basically tells Norman McKay, you have been imbued with a portion of the power that Wesley Dodds had, but more so than that, you are going to be my eyes and ears here on Earth. And where Norman McKay is just kind of like, why in the world, like how could I possibly be suited to fit this? And even himself doesn't fully seem to comprehend everything that's going on. One of the things he says is, explain this to me, right? If you are truly a being of great power, how is it that you can find no way to avert this catastrophe that you say is coming, this Armageddon that you say is going to take place? And the response of the Spectre is, that is not my task. Once Earth boasted other saviors who might have stemmed the tide of destruction, but as you will see, they are no longer the solution solution. They are, in many ways, the problem. And so what the Spectre does is he brings Norman McKay on a journey to show him all these different individuals who are the superheroes of yesterday. What happened to Batman? What happened to Superman? What happened to Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, the Flash, those guys? And so what we find out here is he's taken to Superman basically on a farm. And that as Superman goes around here, of course, Wesley Dodds whispers and whatnot. And the response to the Spectre is, no, you're good. He can't hear you, right? He can't see or hear you. I have shielded you from this. I am that powerful, right? That not even the Man of Steel, who can hear virtually anything, can hear you here. Superman is effectively met by the arrival of Wonder Woman. And the cool thing is that Wonder Woman, the way she speaks here, is she simply says, or at least communicates that she's been coming here relatively frequently. Now, one of the things that I do want to establish here is that Superman does not respond to the name Clark. I mean, he does, but he responds with disdain, right? That's not my name. So when Wonder Woman refers to him as Clark, she corrects herself, then refers to him as Cal. And that's when he starts talking to her, right? He was like, I haven't seen you in months. What brings you to the farm? And this is what's really interesting here, is she says, the vain hope that you're still not here. And Superman says, these are my roots, right? To which he responds, you can't live forever in solitude. That what Superman has done here is basically cut himself off from the rest of humanity, isolated himself in his entirety from everybody else. And what he says is things can grow here, right? This place that I'm in, life can really grow and flourish here. And that's when Wonder Woman responds, but it's all a farce. And when she touches the wall and basically reveals he's in the fortress of solitude, that he's not actually out there in the world living, it really is Superman living a lie, right? She literally chimes in and she says, listen to me, like, you have to do something, right? Like, I've come with news from the outside, and it's bad news. That news has an effect shaking the world, that he's out of control. And that's when Superman says, I tried to tell them that 10 years ago. I tried to tell them they backed the wrong horse, that they should not have gone along with that guy, but they did. And of course, as a result of that, by removing himself from humanity, what Superman's doing is effectively saying, I could save you, but I'm not going to. You chose this path. Now you have to live with it. And humanity's been regretting it every single day. And in fact, Wonder Woman picks up on that and she says, and they don't listen, I know, stop punishing them. And the response to Superman is, I don't care, right? They deserve whatever fate they got. They brought it on themselves. I feel nothing for them. I have no desire to help them at all. And she says, okay, fine. If that's true, right? If that's really the case, then come with me and let me show you the world as it exists right now. Let me show you the outside world, because you've been hiding from it. You've been ignoring it. You've been pretending like it doesn't exist. You cut yourself off from it. Just go and watch and see what's become of the world, but steel yourself, right? Be prepared for what it is that happens. And so he ultimately walks into his area with the viewing screens and he simply just says on. And that's when we end up finding out there's just a colossal event that's taking place. That what had happened is the villain Parasite had basically been chased down by Magog, as well as his, or at least what's referred to as the Justice Battalion. Now, Magog, of course, was the character that you saw in Infinite Frontier, and we'll talk more about him as the story unfolds because he turns out to be hugely important. But it was a massive fight between Parasite and all these different guys, and Parasite was literally just trying to flee, right? It was one of these things where he was begging for his life, he was begging to be saved, he tried to surrender, they wouldn't let him surrender, they quite literally just wanted to kill him. And so in an act of desperation, what Parasite had done is he had torn Captain Atom in half, or at least split him, and when that happened, it basically set off a massive explosion. And what we're told is that early reports indicate immediate casualties numbering close to 1 million, as the dying atom's radioactive energy swept hundreds of kilometers, rendering the entire state of Kansas, as well as part of Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri, an irradiated wasteland. Though Magog's comrades have since prevented further spread of the nuclear blight, the total loss of America's breadbasket, the sterilization of its agrarian culture, has thrown the world economy into near collapse in the face of global famine. That's what we're looking at here. Quite literally, the entirety of the American agricultural industry has just been annihilated by the force of Magog and the recklessness that came with just attacking Parasite in that way. And so the response to Superman, even after having seen all that, is there's nothing I can do from here. Go back to your island, Diana. You're safe there. And walks away, right? And literally just kind of like, that's it. There's nothing I can do. And so, in that instance, the response of Wonder Woman is, we won't all sit here and wait. Like, we won't all deal with this, right? We're not all going to sit here and rest on our laurels. And that's when Norman McKay asked the Spectre, neither will the rest of us, who is she talking about? And the Spectre takes him on a tour of a few others and says that the idea of Superman abandoning his role as a superhero had a huge effect on the entire superhero landscape. That some heroes out there were so disheartened because they took their lead from Superman, they were so disheartened by seeing him so demoralized that when he quit, they quit. That there were others out there who basically started functioning in a way to where they keep their city safe, but nobody ever sees them. A really good example of this is the Flash, right? The Flash just races around the entirety of Keystone City, keeping it safe, keeping it protected, but nobody ever sees him. Nobody ever knows he's there. That you have Hawkman, who basically operates out in the Pacific Northwest as kind of an environmental protector. That you have the Green Lantern, who quite literally made an emerald citadel for himself that orbits the Earth. He's the only occupant there, and he spends all of his days watching for an extraterrestrial threat that will seemingly never come. That all these different people out there, all these members of the superhero community in their own ways, effectively did the exact same thing Superman did to a degree. Now, of course, you end up having Norman McKay who says, but what happened to Batman? What happened to Gotham City? And what it looks like here is that in the city of Gotham, one, Batman's got an entirely automated system that runs, and two, no crime is tolerated in any capacity whatsoever. None, right? Batman has actually become far more extreme than he was when Superman existed, because Superman represented hope. And even if Batman didn't necessarily put that perception on, it permeated him, right? The hope he experienced with Superman was the hope that Gotham City could truly become a better place. And the only thing we get here is the Spectre telling Norman McKay, Batman has a city under control. And so what happens is you have Norman McKay who is taken to a bridge. And this is probably one of the single greatest moments in the entirety of Kingdom Come. He asks him the question like, that's all? That's what you wanted to show me? And the Spectre asks, does that disturb you? And the response of Norman is, yes, right? You're an angel. That makes you a messenger of hope. A greater power sent you. Your very existence is a testament to faith. You mean that all you have to tell me is that those who could save us simply won't? And that's the thing that Norman McKay can't quite grasp his head around, is they could save us. It's not like they were killed. They didn't die in action. They just won't. They simply just won't save us. And I don't understand why. Why are we as humanity simply not worth saving? And so that's when Norman McKay has to come to grips with the fact humanity did it to itself. And so in this moment, when you're on this bridge, you end up having all these heroes, like a great big fight breaks out here. Pandemonium starts reigning supreme. You got the heroes against villains, if you could call them that. And as usual, people are caught in the crossfire. It's just absolute pandemonium. And in fact, what has happened is that in the aftermath of Kansas, that because of the lengths that Magog and his forces went to in order to take out Parasite, that now it kind of feels like all bets are off, right? That whenever it comes to this bar of recklessness and lack of concern for collateral damage, every time it gets raised by Magog, everybody else follows suit. So in a lot of ways, he's kind of the opposite of Superman, right? His antithesis. And so it's really kind of crazy how this goes on. And so what you end up getting is, in the midst of all this, right, you literally have people who were stuck in a cable car about to fall to their death, right? It's virtually the end of these guys. And you have this thing where it's like, can anybody get out here, right? Norman McKay the whole time is like, don't you understand, right? Talking to the Spectre, if any of us are to survive, any of us, now more than ever, we need hope. And then he says, and suddenly there was a wind, right? Not really a wind, a blur of motion, bending the steel of their weapons and changing the very course of the mighty river below. He says, even before the bystanders freed themselves from the cable car, they knew, we all did. We knew and we remembered. And somebody says, look, somebody else says, up in the sky, and it's Superman who's finally returned. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section if you guys want me to finish this. I feel like you guys are gonna be like, yes! Because Kingdom Come is just one of the absolute greatest stories ever in the history of DC Comics, right? It's so cool because you get this little moment here, right? This little kind of a small moment. And when Norman McKay basically says Superman had not turned his back on us, right? He stands in the sky, faith rewarded, he is returned. And dear God, the threat of Armageddon hasn't ended, it's simply just begun. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.